Welcome to Croydon, one of the largest towns in South London. Home to a bustling and vibrant community in the modern day, and more than 1,000 years of history to be discovered on its streets. So, on this walk around Croydon on a sunny but frigid winter's afternoon, we'll explore everything from the mighty Croydon Minster, a storied church with Anglo-Saxon origins, to the buildings of the old Croydon Palace, historically the domain of the Archbishop of Canterbury. We'll also admire grand 19th and 20th century architecture rubbing shoulders on Croydon's main streets. We'll peruse the stalls of Surrey Street Market, one of the oldest markets in all of London. And as the trams pass by, we'll admire the buildings of the Whitgift Almshouses, built in the heart of Croydon back in the 16th century and still used for the very same purpose more than 400 years later. All of that is to come over the next 20 minutes or so, but we begin our walk looking towards the iconic clock tower of Croydon's Old Town Hall, a Victorian-era behemoth that was built back in 1896, and which serves as a perfect introduction to the story of this town. The town hall was built at the end of a century like no other in Croydon's history. Indeed, as the Industrial Revolution hit its peak, between 1801 and 1901, this town's population grew astronomically, more than 23 times in size, with people from far and wide moving in to seek jobs in the factories of London. The speed of this growth in size was initially problematic, the historic medieval town of Croydon quickly becoming overcrowded. But as the decades went by, the local government made efforts to modernise the town and meet the needs of the population. Enter the building that we see here, complete with a soaring clock tower that symbolised Croydon's newfound grandeur at the end of the 19th century. And inside, the brand new offices of the dedicated borough council, the local courthouse, the police station, a public library, and more facilities catering to Croydon residents. To combat the overcrowding that the town had witnessed in the preceding decades, Croydon was one of the first places in England to gain its own public health board, one of many local institutions that helped to grow the modern town in the 19th century. As the 20th century rolled round, meanwhile, this major sculpture of Queen Victoria was erected just outside the town hall, a building which today still hosts some local government facilities, but has also been renovated as a community arts centre, which is now home to the Museum of Croydon, a cafe, and even the David Lean Cinema, a local picture house which is named after celebrated film director David Lean, who was born in Croydon back in 1908, and who went on to make some of the greatest films in history, including Lawrence of Arabia, The Bridge on the River Kwai, Dr. Zhivago, and plenty more. Neighbouring the town hall, meanwhile, is the rather large Spread Eagle pub, housed inside a building of 1893 that for more than a century was home to a bank, situated right at the heart of the modern town, overlooking Croydon's historic High Street. Now, as we know, while this part of Croydon is dominated by Victorian architecture, this town's history stretches back much further. Before the town hall with the clock tower was built in the 1890s, Croydon's town hall was a much smaller building that stood on the High Street just here. It was built more than 450 years ago in 1566, and served not just as a venue for local government, but also a market house, where people would come to buy and sell a wide variety of goods. No trace of that original 16th century town hall remains today, but for many years afterwards, the High Street retained its role as a busy centre of trade. In the Victorian era, this street was lined with merchant shops of all kinds: printers, chemists, corn merchants, coal merchants, bakers, and bootmakers. While the building that we can see just here, which proclaims its sale of lace, gloves, silks, dresses, and more, was once Grant's department store, built back in 1894, and which for nearly a century served as one of Croydon's leading shopping complexes. However, almost all of the historic merchant shops of the High Street are distant memories today, because the centre of activity in Croydon has shifted a few hundred yards further north, to a large pedestrianised street called North End, which lies just across the tram tracks from us here. But this view at the foot of North End is perhaps the most quintessentially Croydonian panorama you'll find anywhere in town. The trams, an icon of the town that we'll talk more about later, pass by North End and descend down Church Street, a storied road that leads towards the mighty Croydon Minster, which we'll also be visiting at the end of our walk. Turning back towards North End though, it's here on the corner that there stands one of Croydon's most famous buildings of all, the Whitgift Almshouses, a complex of 16th century buildings which, through more than 400 years of change and development in Croydon, are still standing. Dating back to 1596, these almshouses are officially known as the Hospital of the Holy Trinity, and they were originally built as a place of sanctuary for the poor, elderly and sick people of Croydon. In that spirit, above the doorway here on North End, you'll find the Latin inscription, Qui dat pauperi non indigebit, he who gives to the poor shall not lack. And it's a motto which still rings true in Croydon even in the 21st century. Because these historic almshouses, surrounded by modern shops and offices on all sides, are still being used for the very same purpose as when they were first built. Home to around 15 residents, the almshouses have been described as an oasis of peace and tranquility in the heart of this bustling town. Indeed, as a working institution, they generally aren't open to the general public, with the exception of occasional open days or organised visits that allow you inside what is undoubtedly one of Croydon's most remarkable buildings of all. But as we mentioned, the historic Whitgift Almshouses stand completely alone among the modern buildings of central Croydon, particularly the soaring buildings of North End just here, nowadays the town's main shopping street. As we know, huge population growth in the 19th century caused the historic town of Croydon to become overcrowded. But over time the town swelled in size to accommodate this large influx of people, expanding primarily northwards in the direction of London. This street, known as North End, was once a residential street on the northern edge of Croydon. But as the town grew, it became more centrally located, and began to develop into a busy commercial street, home not just to shops, but busy local pubs, and later cinemas and major shopping centres. Now, as you can see, the profile of North End has changed dramatically since it first gained prominence. The western side here today home to the huge Centrale shopping centre, opened back in 2004. Today it's one of the largest shopping centres in all of London, having replaced the much smaller Drummond Centre, which had opened in the mid-1980s and stood on the same site before it was incorporated into this larger complex. However, just across North End from Centrale is probably Croydon's most famous shopping centre of all, the Whitgift, which opened its doors all the way back in 1970. One of the earliest indoor shopping centres in the whole country, the Whitgift was also enormous. Dozens upon dozens of shops under one roof. In fact, Croydon's Whitgift Centre was London's largest shopping centre of all for a staggering 38 years, eventually overtaken by the Westfield Centre in White City in 2008. Despite losing the title after so many years, the shopping centre still remains one of the most beloved symbols of this town among locals. Indeed, as we saw at the Whitgift Almshouses, the name Whitgift is one that you'll see popping up all over Croydon. So where does it come from? Well, the name is from one John Whitgift, who back in the 16th century held the position of Archbishop of Canterbury, the most senior bishop in the Church of England. He was the man who established the almshouses in 1596 to help those in need in Croydon, and in the same year he also founded the Whitgift School, which for centuries was situated right here on North End. An independent boys' school, the Whitgift School is also still operating all these years later, although it moved from the busy surroundings of central Croydon to the south of the town in the 1930s. And it's one of many examples of the Archbishop's long-lasting impact on this town. But the question has to be asked, why was he so concerned with the welfare of the people of Croydon? Well, we're now going to begin making our way towards Croydon's Old Town, where you'll find the buildings of the old Palace of Croydon, a 14th century residence which was once owned by the Archbishops of Canterbury. It was one of a number that lined the route between Canterbury and Lambeth Palace, just across the River Thames from London's Houses of Parliament. And as such, Croydon Palace was used by the archbishops as overnight accommodation as they made their way between their two main headquarters. As they passed through, they would have witnessed firsthand the lives of people in this Surrey town. And at the end of the tumultuous 16th century, when John Whitgift was archbishop, he recognised the impact of conflict and disease on the townspeople. Seeking to help, he established charitable institutions in the town, which as we know are still operating to this day. But the truth is that they're far from the only long-running traditions that you'll find in Croydon in the 21st century. Just to the left ahead is a small road called Surrey Street, and 6 days a week, Surrey Street is the venue for one of the longest-running marketplaces in all of London. Always buzzing with energy and activity, this truly traditional marketplace can trace its history back at least 750 years, all the way to 1275. There was almost certainly informal market trade taking place here before then, but it was in the late 13th century that Croydon was granted an official market charter, giving the town the rights to hold markets, and which drew in traders from far and wide. At the time, the market here was much more expansive than what we see today. It covered much of the area between Surrey Street here and the High Street, where we started our walk. Like many traditional marketplaces, you would have found different products in different sectors of Croydon's market. Up on the High Street were typically stalls selling corn, grains, flour and other similar goods. Whereas down here on Surrey Street, you would have been more likely to find traders selling livestock, meat and animal skins and hides. For that reason, this street was actually known for much of history as Butcher Row. In fact, it was only in 1834 that it was renamed as Surrey Street, around the time when the historic medieval marketplace was beginning to change into the one that we see today. The market is overlooked across the street by the Dog and Bull pub, an 18th century inn which was built on the site of a historic 12th century inn that was originally called the Bell, one of the many changes that Surrey Street has seen over the centuries. Indeed, for a long time, the markets here weren't held 6 days a week. It was rather once a week for many centuries. But in the 1920s, control of the market was taken over by the Croydon Corporation, who turned it into a 6-day marketplace, with stalls set up here every day from Monday through Saturday. Of those, Saturday has traditionally been the busiest day of all, and coincidentally, we're walking here among the crowds on a sunny Saturday afternoon, witnessing Surrey Street at its liveliest, with a wealth of fresh produce on sale wherever you look. So, in the space of just under 15 minutes, and in just a couple of streets, we've experienced some of the most iconic Croydon landmarks and sights. From the famous clock tower, to the almshouses, the stalls of Surrey Street, and of course, the Whitgift Centre. But there's one more unmistakable feature of Croydon that runs right through the heart of town. Yes, it's the trams. Now, around 100 years ago, you would have seen trams on the streets of towns all over London, and Croydon was no special exception. But over time, cars, buses and the London Underground became the favoured forms of transport in the city, and trams were entirely removed from London's streets. In places served by the London Underground, this wasn't a devastating loss. But Croydon, a town of around 200,000 people, located just 10 miles south of central London, actually has no tube station, and never has done. So, as the population here continued to grow during the 20th century, the roads became ever more congested with buses and cars. So, to improve capacity, a brand new tram system was opened in Croydon back in the year 2000, linking the town centre here with Wimbledon to the west and Beckenham to the east. Nowadays, more than 20 million people ride the trams every year, and they've fast become a real point of pride for Croydon, as the only place in London where you'll find this form of public transport. Through the town centre, the trams make their way along Church Street here, which, as the name suggests, leads in the direction of the town's main church, Croydon Minster, which we'll be visiting in just a few minutes' time. But the Minster Church is one of the many historic landmarks to be found in Croydon's Old Town, an area which will take us back to Croydon's earliest origins, that can be traced all the way back to the Anglo-Saxon era, more than 1,000 years ago. We enter the Old Town by turning left off Church Street into the blinding sun that's shining along Old Palace Road. As this name suggests, Old Palace Road leads towards the Old Palace of Croydon, the former residence of the Archbishop of Canterbury, which since 1889 has been repurposed as the home of an independent school for girls. The modern school buildings can be seen on the street corner just across the road ahead of us. But within the complex there are some of the original medieval palace buildings still standing, and we'll get a closer look at them in a couple of minutes' time. Now, the Old Town here is the historic heart of Croydon, an important centre of life long before industrial era growth saw the town explode in size and shift towards North End. And as such, these streets feel centuries away from the busy shopping parades and modern buildings that we saw just a few minutes ago. The town of Croydon is thought to have begun in this area back in the Anglo-Saxon era. Indeed, the first mention of this place's name came in the year 962 AD. Now, the story behind Croydon's name isn't certain, but it's often said that it derives from the Old English Croydene, which literally refers to the Valley of the Crocus plants, flowers which were grown in the valley of the small river Wandle for centuries, possibly since as long ago as the Roman era. Again, this part of Croydon feels worlds away from where we started out. The quaint flint cottages here, built back in the Victorian era, and complete with some fetching black and white facades, really showcasing how this town was once very much separate from the gravity of London, instead existing as a market town like many others around the rural county of Surrey. From its early Anglo-Saxon origins, the establishment of the market first brought Croydon to prominence in the medieval era. But over the centuries, as people began travelling further across England, this town cemented itself as an important stopping point for people journeying southwards out of London. We already know the story of the Archbishops of Canterbury, but in the late 18th century, when London's wealthy began flocking to the seaside resort of Brighton, many would make a stop here in Croydon, and many local businesses would profit from the passing trade. The building of railways in the 19th century, better connecting Croydon to the rest of the region, was another major factor in the town's huge population growth. And in that process, the Old Town here soon became unable to cope. And as we walk its historic streets, it's no surprise why. Indeed, here we find ourselves in the heart of the Old Town, the grounds of Croydon Minster boasting the atmosphere of a small countryside village, not a major urban settlement. This mighty church has been standing in some form or other since the very beginning of the town's history, in the Anglo-Saxon period. But the building as we see it today is much younger, completed in 1869, after the original medieval church, which dated to the late 14th century, was destroyed in a devastating fire of 1867. To have lost such a significant landmark of Old Croydon is a shame, but the modern-day church is a fetching place of worship nonetheless. Designed by the celebrated architect Sir George Gilbert Scott, who also worked on iconic landmarks, including London's St Pancras Station, Croydon's main church here boasts the title of Minster, an honorific title which was given to the church back in 2011, in recognition of its religious and historic significance. This was in part because of the links with the Archbishop of Canterbury, although early medieval evidence actually shows that the church was referred to as a minster as long ago as the early 9th century. A major peace treaty was signed near here by the Archbishop of Canterbury and the King of Mercia, an Anglo-Saxon kingdom that covered much of central England. And this important meeting was recorded in Latin as having taken place Juxta monasterium quod dicitur Crogedena, next to the minster known as Croydon. It's one of many moments of great historical significance to have taken place in and around the grounds of this captivating church. And today we can take in a beautiful view of the Minster Tower from beside the parish war memorial here, dedicated to locals who lost their lives fighting in the First World War. Now, as we know, while the old town once stood at the heart of life in Croydon, the town has shifted away from this area. And so nowadays, the Minster Churchyard stands on the edge of the modern town centre. But despite this, it's well worth venturing out here if you're keen to explore Croydon's history, particularly to witness some intriguing hidden gems. On this side, the churchyard is bounded by the buildings of the old Palace of Croydon, the historic residence of the Archbishop of Canterbury. But he wasn't the only major figure to stay here. Just in the corner of the churchyard, you'll find a small door, which is known simply as the Queen's Doorway. Just as the name suggests, this narrow entrance is believed to have been used by none other than Queen Elizabeth I, who was a regular guest at Croydon Palace. Queen Elizabeth is even said to have had her own room at the palace here, and she would have used this doorway to gain easy access to the church in order to worship. Now, many other monarchs would have stayed at the palace here on their way out of London. Indeed, the side of the palace that we're looking at here is significantly older than the school buildings on Old Palace Road. In fact, it's often been said that Croydon Palace, originally built back in the 14th century, was one of England's very first brick buildings. Between its original construction and the founding of the girls' school, it wasn't just used as the Archbishop's residence. In the industrial era, the buildings of the old palace actually found a number of different uses, occupied at different points by a linen printing company, a bleaching works, and even a laundry. Today, though, it stands strong in a historic corner of this captivating town. And while we've made our way to the very edge of central Croydon, there is one more unusual landmark for us to take a look at. The corner of the churchyard here is marked by an archway, which is known locally as the Tudor Arch. That's because it was likely built in the Tudor period, roughly 500 years ago in the 16th century, and it once belonged to the old palace. But in the Victorian era, in the 19th century, it was moved to the edge of the churchyard here, and nobody really knows why. It's thought that at the time, the Archbishop sold off much of the land he owned in this area of Croydon, and local developers built new houses, while the churchyard here was expanded in size. But somebody was particularly keen to keep this archway standing, and so it has done, humbly occupying its position in this riveting corner of Croydon. A town which, as we've seen, is filled to the brim with captivating stories wherever you look. This view alone, with the Tudor Arch in the foreground and modern tower blocks in the back, perfectly sums up the stark contrasts to be found on a walk around Croydon. And I hope you've enjoyed seeing the sights from the bustling heart of the modern town to the quaint streets of the old town on this wonderfully sunny afternoon. But sadly, it's here beside the historic churchyard that our walk around Croydon has reached its end. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. And I hope you're planning your own visit to explore the history of Croydon for yourself sometime soon.